Hey, it's Shabes. If you've been into anime long enough, and especially Shonen Jump, you might have seen this character drifting around. This is Fusuke, and he's from a series called Ninku.
Blackout in the middle of the line, and now back down with the feeling, and I can lie. You know it won't be long until the end. Let the spotlight shine on me. Give me permission to feel alive. Well, little let me amplify. And will you see me on the floor? It's just a part of my show.
Ninku starts as a manga serialized in Weekly Shonen Jump between 1993 and 1995, but disappeared from the magazine for 5 months after 53 chapters in July of 1994. I couldn't find a precise reason for this interruption, though there's a message in the back of Volume 6 from the author and artist Koji Kiriyama, reflecting on his time writing Ninku. One of his biggest regrets was how he spent too much time thinking and could not avoid having only a short amount of time devoted to actually drawing the manga, which caused a lot of trouble for the people around him and for the manga itself. Kiriyama would get another shot when Ninku returned to Shonen Jump, this time with the subtitle Second Stage, which functions less as a part 2 like JoJo's or Chainsaw Man, but more as a prequel since the original had started somewhat in media res. Unfortunately, Ninku wouldn't stick around for much longer, disappearing from the magazine again 35 issues later, leaving a total of 82 chapters in 9 volumes. But Ninku would manage to stage a comeback a whole decade later. In 2005, Second Stage was continued in the seinen magazine Ultra Jump, this time running for 12 volumes, longer than its original run in the Wall Street Journal. Not that you could read any of this yourself, at least in English. At this current moment, only 4 chapters have been translated by fans, but I did flip through the whole series raw just to get a rough understanding of it. I try not to spend time on synopses in my videos, since you could just look them up yourself, but broadly speaking about the content, Ninku treads the same path as many of its Jump contemporaries. It starts out as an episodic adventure series with some action, drama, and edgy humor, but soon it ramps up in intensity with longer continuous stories, and escalates to grand fights and power systems, embodying that pseudo-genre that isn't really a genre, but it's colloquially considered its own genre. You know the kind. Ninku are basically an elite army of ninjas. There's 12 captains that represent the 12 zodiac animals, and they specialize in different elemental techniques. But as far as I can tell, the reader is never introduced to all 12 of the captains, like you would in, say, Bleach or Black Clover, which is fine because there's actually a bit of a twist here. The story focuses on 5 of the captains, including Fusuke as the captain of the first squad. He's an airbender. I think that's pretty novel for this trope, having your main character be a member of this group of leaders from the start instead of having that group functioning separately as an ensemble. The other major Ninku characters are Aicho, the 10th captain, and Toji, the 6th captain. And other supporting characters include Fusuke's penguin companion Hiroyuki, as well as Toji's sister Ryoko, who isn't a Ninku, but I guess fills that role of the normal human in the group. They're pretty much all that's left after this war where, slight spoilers, they voluntarily surrender and a bunch of Ninku appear to decapitate themselves? Oh! Again, the bulk of this manga is still untranslated, so I'm having difficulty figuring out the context. And before you ask, wait, didn't you watch the anime? Yes. And this does not happen. Anyway, the organization they were at war with is still set on eliminating them, which includes villainizing the Ninku to the whole world, so they're treated as dangerous. Kinda like One Piece's pirates, but it's really a lie. That's pretty much the gist of it. The Ninku travel around trying to fight and survive. I wish I could give more detail than that, but I can only get so far from visuals alone. Speaking of those visuals, as an artistic experience, the paneling is plain and the art can seem a little crude or amateur. But I can understand why. Kiriyama is clearly going for a pretty detailed aesthetic for a weekly manga series. And like he mentions, Kiriyama was not the best at time management. This is not for lack of drawing talent. Fusuke, really just his face, is the only super cartoonish element. Everything else is drawn fairly realistic, from the faces to the clothes to the backgrounds. Kiriyama doesn't use a deforming shorthand, drawing his characters in a simpler style for humor. He draws humor out of exaggerated expressions with teeth bulging and faces wrinkling. It's a fun choice, though it does come off to me as a little garish sometimes. As unimpressive I think the art can be much of the time, it's bolstered by a lot of compelling, visceral action, and frankly breathtaking spreads. Like, I think every two-pager Kiriyama drew managed to really impress me, either with his technical ability or by his artistic choices. But maybe I'm just a sucker for two-page spreads. As any good artist does, I think Kiriyama noticeably improves a decade later with his second stage sequel. Everything seems more refined and well realized, probably because he was able to spend more time planning and drawing for a monthly magazine instead of a weekly one. I can't speak much on second stage either because it's untranslated, but you know what I could speak on because it is translated, as of only recently. Okay, so first there was the 30-minute special that was made for Jump Super Anime Tour, which seems to be the Jump Festa of its day. It's the pilot, basically. And funny enough, the original story of this pilot later gets adapted into the manga as an extra chapter between the first and second stage, confirmed by Kiriyama saying it's based on this pilot. Then, during the TV anime's run, there was another special made for Toei's Anime Fair. It's labeled as a movie, and on one hand, it's only 20 minutes, but on the other, it is the only Ninku anime that's in widescreen, so I guess we can consider it a movie. By the way, this is actually the only Ninku-related thing that we got in the US. Given that these two specials are episode length, essentially we can think of the anime as 57 episodes. The anime was brought to my attention by a mutual friend, and what convinced me to watch it, besides its metatextual influences that I'll touch upon later, he told me it's a full adaptation, which I thought was extraordinary for a Shonen Jump anime. Every other Jump anime I had watched besides Naruto in 2021 was not a complete adaptation one way or another, so this really made me want to check it out. However, not to throw shade on my friend, but I've come to discover that the Ninku anime is not only not a complete adaptation, it's barely an adaptation at all. Out of the 57 episodes, only 9 of those episodes adapt manga material. The story and characters are still generally the same, but the majority of the anime is completely original. Now, that's not to say it's all filler. I mean, it creates its own long-running story.
This could have easily fooled newcomers that it was a regular adaptation.
That's what I had been assuming for most of the time I was watching it. I can imagine if this were an anime coming out now, based on a manga that English fans actually had access to beforehand, they would be outraged at such a choice. Some Japanese fans probably were at the time. But unless you're a purist about adaptations, I think so long as what you deliver instead is just as good or better than the source, there should be no problem. And I'd argue Ninku's anime accomplishes that. From what I can discern from the manga, the story appears to be more aimless and thrown together. There are some recurring characters that are forgotten about in favor of new ones, whereas the anime keeps many of them recurring throughout, specifically Toji and Ryoko, which results in much more realized characters in the anime. Again, just from what I can discern. Even Hiroyuki gets super strength and super farts, which sounds stupid, I know, but honestly, it was way better than just existing. Seriously, Hiroyuki is this glorified mascot character for like 5 chapters, and then he's relegated to the background, hardly addressed again. It makes me wonder if Kiriyama realized he was actually kind of annoying to draw, so he stopped featuring him. I prefer how the anime starts with a dramatic flashback of Fusuke's mom being taken away, so his inevitable goal is to try and find her and defeat the tattooed man who took her. That's a major narrative and emotional through line that's not present in the manga at all, from what I can tell. Maybe that's a little cliche, but I prefer that to the manga where he's just vibing. Don't get me wrong, I like my MC just vibing, but vibing with a goal makes it even better. The anime has standalone adventures with Fusuke, except there's a lot more of them, and spread throughout the runtime instead of just a few towards the beginning of the manga. In fact, close to half of the whole anime are standalone, isolated episodes,
as well as 9 2-episode mini-arcs.
Ninku doesn't have a story arc that goes longer than 5 episodes. and yet it's still kept together as a constantly progressing story with definable arcs. The heroes are on a mission to do this, now they're heading this way, and now they gotta do that, etc. It's actually a lot like Pokemon, having a ton of episodic stories strung along by Ash's gym challenges. Oh, they happen to have the same Seiyu. And that structure is not something I could confidently say the same for the manga, which had longer arcs but felt more uneven. The villains of Ninku are expanded in the anime from just a band of masked villains in some random tower on a beach to a whole empire with entire armies and bases, with 3 recurring generals invented for the anime. This includes a compelling change from the manga, where one of the Ninku captains are actually one of the generals. That's a major plot point that is anime original from what I gather. So is this mystical energy dragon that acts like a MacGuffin of sorts. There is a similar looking dragon that shows up in the 2005 manga, but I imagine that's another case where manga is taking from anime. Though if I were to give one thing to the manga over the anime, the climax of the manga seems a lot more intimate and raw, whereas I thought the anime's climax felt somewhat melodramatic and overblown. It honestly comes off more like the climax of a Naruto filler movie, with power-hungry, one-dimensional bad guy fighting at the top of this huge tower, and everything so dire and earth-shattering. It clashes with the rest of the material, in my opinion. However, I don't want to move on without giving special attention to 2 of my favorite parts. The first is one of the standalone adventures, episode 41. It's storyboarded and directed by Akiyuki Shimbo, and the character designs changed dramatically for this one episode. The villain seems like an homage to Toshiro Mifune's character in Yojimbo. It feels super different and way more film-like than the actual Ninku film. Again, it is standalone, so if you want a sampler of anything from this show, I think this would be a good episode. Second would be the only arc of the anime that actually adapts the manga somewhat accurately, but for good reason, because it's fantastic. Basically, a bunch of assassins are sent after the Ninku, and the leader happens to be a former apprentice of Aicho's. It's very emotionally charged and exciting. I think it's my favorite point in the show, and reading the manga alongside it, even if I can't read the dialogue, I can tell the anime tweaked it in several places and improved already good material. Oh, and I can't not mention that during this fight there's a part where they use music that also is in Yu Yu Hakusho. That'll make sense in a second. While I can't properly decide which version of Ninku is better on a story front, since I haven't properly read the manga yet, to me, the anime completely blows the manga out of the water on a visual front. I don't mean to discredit Kiriyama's hard work. The anime production just did that good of a job. This is probably the most consistently best-looking Jump anime I watched this year on a pure animation basis. Each episode looks stellar, and that's all thanks to the people who made it at Studio Pierrot, of which I think Ninku is a pretty significant work in the studio's history. Now, side story, out of curiosity, because I was watching a lot of Jump anime made by Toei Animation, I wanted to know just how many Jump anime Toei had made compared to every other studio, which led me to make a whole chart of every Jump anime, recording a few aspects including who made each one. Toei does have the most, with 20, but in a comfortable second place is Studio Pierrot with 12. These two are the kings of Jump anime. The next highest is TMS with 6, and that's before you realize the bulk of the most popular Jump anime are split between the 2 of them. Though that wasn't always the case. It's interesting when you track the history. Toei had a practical monopoly on the most popular action-heavy Jump titles throughout the 80s. Pierrot was like every other studio at the time. They managed to get a few Jump titles here or there, but nothing on the level of Fist of the North Star, Dragon Ball, or Saint Seiya. Pierrot's fortunes would turn towards the start of the decade, when they managed to snag Yu Yu Hakusho. It would become a pretty big success, running for over 100 episodes. It's a major turning point for the studio when you chart their history. I think it's why they've been entrusted with so many Jump adaptations, including 2 of the 2000s big 3, Naruto and Bleach. But to bring this back to Ninku, it was one of 4 Jump anime that Pierrot had made between Yu Yu Hakusho and their next long-running action series, Naruto. However, the other 3 Jump anime were gag comedies and sports series, but Ninku was Pierrot's next action-heavy Jump anime between Yu Yu Hakusho and Naruto, creating a sort of lineage. In fact, Ninku is the anime that replaced Yu Yu Hakusho in its time slot on Saturdays at 6:30 with Fuji TV. A ton of staff transferred over too. There's a cool feature on Anime News Network where you can easily compare staff between different anime. Yu Yu Hakusho and Ninku share the same director, Noriyuki Abe, the same art director, sound director, director of photography, music composer, and several scriptwriters, storyboarders, animation directors, episode directors, producers, and voice actors. And animators, but you get the picture. Yes, the same thing would happen for Midori no Makibao. Abe also directed that series, and it would take the time slot after Ninku, but I'm pretty sure Makibao didn't have ninjas, elemental powers, or Rasengans. I mean, okay, those are pretty obvious connections to Naruto. I think it runs deeper than that. For one, Ninku, I think, bridges the gap of action between Yu Yu Hakusho and Naruto. Yu Yu Hakusho's action is great, but leans more on energy blasts and special attacks. It's got punches and kicks too, of course, but it's a little more basic and fast. Ninku and subsequently Naruto would introduce even more tactile, close combat, though of course they each have their share of energy attacks too.
But what's most interesting to me,
Ninku would be a valuable experience for Pierrot in anime original storytelling. Remember, the vast majority of Ninku's anime is not strictly faithful to its manga, unlike Yu Yu Hakusho. In an interview with Anime to commemorate Ninku's recent Blu-ray, director Abe said he used the taste of the original, since the series was still in its infancy. He worked it on the fly. There was a lot of fighting over whether to make it a war story or a road movie. The staff clashed with each other every week as they made the film. That's why they were able to create many variations in the episodes. Ninku was an anime where he was able to learn how to construct a mostly original story from a small number of characters throughout a year. It's about how to put the setting of the whole story in the scenario of each episode. While Abe would go on to be the director of Bleach and not Naruto, I think the principle still applies for the studio that made all 3. What I'm saying is, I think Ninku was practice for all the anime original content that Naruto and Bleach would necessitate if it meant continuing their adaptations for as long as they managed to. While fans obviously hate this approach because it so often doesn't turn out well, the utility it had at the time is something to be commended for over the alternative of catching up to the manga and that's all we get. While this applies to Bleach as well, I think some fans might already know why I'm focusing more on Naruto and not both it and Bleach. Because Studio Pierrot isn't the only link between Naruto and Ninku. Fusuke's Rasengan-looking attack and the ninja theme, while obvious, aren't exactly coincidences. Naruto's mangaka Masashi Kishimoto is a noted Ninku fan, saying right here,
That
could be taken as tongue-in-cheek, but there's an even more significant connection. Apparently, when Naruto was getting an anime, they had chosen Hirofumi Suzuki for character designer. But Kishimoto specifically requested Tetsuya Nishio too, who was Ninku's character designer. Apparently, Kishimoto was particularly inspired by Ninku's OP, but I could only find secondhand reporting of that in particular. But I think the connection is there based on the facts that Nishio was handpicked by Kishimoto to work on Naruto, and that Ninku became a sort of calling card for him. Ninku was Nishio's first time as character designer and as an animation director. In that same interview from Anime, by getting involved in Ninku, he was able to go from an animator to learning about how all sorts of people were fighting to make it happen. It was a second starting point. I met Kishimoto from Naruto the other day and told him how he needs to make Ninku vs. Naruto a reality. Nishio also brings up the lineage Ninku shares not just with Yu Yu Hakusho and Naruto, but Pierrot as a whole. These shows, as well as Pierrot's other works like Bleach or Black Clover,
often have standout episodes of impressive action animation.
For these action scenes, Nishio says, on the storyboard, there's just a note that says, "Thanks, action team." The person who wants to draw it, or is good at it, gets put in charge of it, and that's how it ends up on screen. Because it was done by someone who wanted to draw it, who could draw it, or someone who was good at it, and that's why it still leaves a lasting impression and is still talked about today. Pierrot producer Ken Hagino mentioned from the middle of Yu Yu Hakusho, there was a trend of people who came to Pierrot looking to do what they enjoy there. Nishio calls this a tradition at the studio. He used to be a viewer of Urusei Yatsura, but in the middle of the series, a lot of action animators joined the company and even changed the direction of the show. And to cap this all off, probably the best find in this interview, Abe asks Nishio about the ninja run that was used in Ninku. It's still called the Ninja Run or Naruto Run today. Is there an origin to that? It's the one that Masayuki Yoshihara drew in Tomb of Knives. I think the general image that people imagine is the ninja in the Dagger of Kamui, who is running with only the lower half of their body without waving his hands. In the flashback scene at the beginning, the dead older brother was running like that. I think that's where it all started, and led to where we are now. While the origin seems to be Dagger of Kamui, it could be argued that Ninku is part of why we have the Naruto run. I think we should just leave it off there.
I want to especially thank Harry on Twitter for translating not just Kiriyama's note, but also this really valuable interview. I'll link the whole thing in the description. I think Ninku is worth checking out if you've grown to care about the history of Shonen Jump anime, or even as a casual fan of these series, and definitely if you're an animation fan. Now that the whole anime is translated, there's never been a better time to check it out, but at the very least I hope you found this video interesting. I'll see you again to talk a lot more, about the more popular ninja anime later this year. Yo, peace.
We're haters